Good evening, everybody. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this year's distinguished lecture of the Chair of Social Anthropology here at the University of Basel. It's also my pleasure to introduce Judith Okely to you today. I will keep my introduction very short, just a few words about her, but also about our discipline. And when we were exchanging a few ideas yesterday and today, we immediately became aware that we share also certain experiences of, in particular, how anthropology is seen from outside. And one of these experiences is that anthropology is mainly seen as a very strange discipline, something that nobody else understands except anthropologists. And in particular, other social sciences are sometimes quite reluctant to recognize the value of anthropological research and in particular our methodology. It reminded me of an encounter and a conversation I had with a very famous German sociologist a couple of years ago. He's no longer alive, so it's more of a sort of memory that I still have in my mind. And he says, anthropology is really fascinating. It's one of the most fascinating disciplines that he can imagine, because it draws its identity from its methodology, its methods, though it doesn't have any. So that was something that makes us sometimes a little bit curious of how we are seen from outside. And I mention this because Judith has worked about how anthropologists have developed their own field, how they developed an interest in empirical methodologies, how they came to conduct field research, and in particular participant observation or participation and observation, as we would say here. And it also is linked to her own personal life experience as a social anthropology in a department that became increasingly more sociologist in the University of Halle. But before I come back to this, I would like to say a few words about her life. She has written a PhD in nationality, was awarded a PhD in 1976 and 7 at Oxford University. Then was a part-time professor at different universities, and I would like to mention only two universities here. One is actually, for the time being, under the threat of being closed, that is the Central European University in Budapest in Hungary, which is threatened by Viktor Orban, is he Prime Minister or President of Hungary? I don't know that, but at least he is a threat to that university. And the other university where Judith had taught for many years is the University of Halle, and that is also the university that thought that anthropology is not necessary anymore. I think that is simply a mistake, but of course we anthropologists think differently about this. And I think where our interests join, and that's also why Judith is here today, is that neutrality of research is an illusion. We anthropologists work through our presence in the social life of others. We are present there not only as research instruments, but as human beings. And as human beings, of course, we interact with others. We make their life ours, and of course also vice versa, we make our lives theirs. And this tension between them and us is something that is explored in fieldwork. It is not about a positivist understanding of what social science is. It is much more about how we gain insights into the lives of others and what they learn about us during this process. So it's also about our bodies. It's about our bodily presence in the life of others, and our bodies become instruments of research when we do this. If a sociologist claims that this is not a method, then it's up to him to judge whether he can live without a body. I would be curious to learn if anybody can. But that's more or less the subject of her talk today, and what it meant to different anthropologists. Judith also mentioned when we talked that she doesn't conduct interviews anymore, Or perhaps you've done so in the beginning, but you have given up on this, and I actually share that experience as well. Very often interviews don't lead very far. But actually she does conduct interviews, in particular with other anthropologists. And that's why she immediately asked me how I found my field yesterday evening and, and how I developed an interest in anthropology and in my field site. I didn't say much about it, only 2 or 3 sentences, and the easier answer is the answer that every anthropologist can give. It's by accident. Okay, that's what I wanted to say about the work. We are curious to hear from you what you have to say about the subject, and I would like to thank in particular our student assistants here who have prepared and helped us to prepare this lecture. Ilona Mollak and Alina Küchenhoff, and last but not least, our assistant professor Rita Kesselring, who has organized this event here for the chair of social anthropology and has given me the honor to introduce Judith to you. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Yes, I was saying earlier that I began having discussions with anthropologists, and I found that when I interviewed people, is there something wrong here? Well, that's me interviewing her. When I chose to, I call it a dialogue, because I wanted to, I had all the transcripts for a book on fieldwork, and then I was visiting Brian Morris, and I started asking him questions, and he came up with such amazing answers. I said, "Do you have a tape recorder?" He said yes. And I wrote the questions on the back of an envelope, but they were questions I'd been thinking about for a decade. And I started asking him the questions, and we turned off the tape recorder 4 hours later. And then I repeated those questions to over 20 anthropologists through the years, and my book completely changed. I rewrote it, and I cut and pasted things in the chapters. But when I, as it were, interviewed people who I didn't know, they sat bolt upright and they gave me the answers they thought I wanted to hear, which is just the same with Gypsies. And by the way, I use the word gypsy because the people I lived with and the people I still meet call themselves gypsies. They are not Roma, although the EU have told me I'm not allowed to use the word gypsy in the public domain, and they call themselves gypsies. So who am I to say that the EU have told you you've got to call yourself something different? Anyway, the people who I didn't know, the answers were useless. But so I broke also the scientific rules where I interviewed people I already knew, and the relaxed atmosphere produced wonderful answers. So I'll start this lecture, and thank you very much for inviting me. It's a great honour, and here is the book in English of the person after whom this lecture is remembered. There are continuing controversies as to what is understood as ethnographic fieldwork, despite more than a century of anthropologists doing what Malinowski called pitching one's tent in the village, as you see. Others have revised and reinterpreted research in what is regrettably a scientific way. The physicist Professor Stephen Rose regretted how many social scientists had what he called physics envy. This ideal of imagined, near-invented abstraction defies the power of disciplines such as social anthropology. Only recently a commentator reverentially described the physicist Wolfgang Pauli as not getting his hands dirty when formulating the quantum mechanics principle. By supreme contrast, the anthropologist has to get his or her hands dirty. That is part of the fun, and what is also a scientific route to knowledge about the full range of humanity. We get our hands, indeed our bodies, dirty through participant observation, then our fingers are smudged when writing about that experience. So here we have Malinowski. Sociology, whose Chicago specialist actually invented the term participant observation, has sometimes drifted into quantitative priorities, where questionnaires are privileged over engagement. Note-taking is erased by ticking boxes for pre-arranged questions. The celebrated Bachofen may not have engaged in ethnographic fieldwork in the 19th century, but travelled far from any laboratory to varied countries, driven by curiosity for both difference and continuity in humanity's past. Clues and signs were to be disentangled from ancient objects, as well as literature. The published word conserves centuries-old texts. The classicist lived with the published voices of the dead and their artifacts, especially tombs, as revered traces of what are called ancient, indeed awesome civilizations where only the dominant elite were literate. As for fieldwork, by the early 20th century, social anthropology had moved from armchair to veranda to tent, and I moved to tarmac. Fraser's The Golden Bough, 1890, was constructed from others' written examples around the globe. His sources were travellers, missionaries, traders, and colonial officials who had face-to-face encounters with different peoples. Fraser built on the notes of others as witnesses, rarely researchers. Anthropology has moved to direct control. I don't know what's happened here, but anyway. And anthropology has moved to direct control. This is a problem with technology, but I've still got a voice. Moved to direct contact, shared living. The field worker becomes the multi-skilled researcher, recorder, and final author. Very different from modern desk-bound principal investigators analysing others' data without encountering the research subjects. Today, I celebrate those who've embraced the multifaceted role from field worker to author. I interviewed anthropologists who've done research around the globe in the late 20th century and after, and a number of cultures were still primarily non-literate. The anthropologist is necessarily literate. Ensuing publications were explored for textual strategy, like Clifford and Marcus's Writing Culture. Only later were field notes problematised by Roger Sanjet in 1990. Next, Emerson et al.'s publication was explicitly for student guidance, almost instruction. But homogenization risks burying individual details in footnotes. Instead, this lecture offers specific examples linked to the grounded context of the fieldworkers analysed in my 212 anthropological practice. Their unpublished testimonies are integral to earlier published explorations. I was told that the word length was limited of this book, so I couldn't include any chapters on field notes, and that's why this has been a wonderful opportunity. My additional examples in this lecture highlight recent fieldwork by younger generations. Nevertheless, the majority of the cited anthropologists in this book did their major fieldwork before any methods courses, so they offer insights into innovative strategies. The context and process of writing field notes are varied. Extended details of the anthropologist's descriptions will have to wait the lecture's publication. I've got wonderful long quotes, but I haven't got time to read them all out. As with the earlier research process, there are both contrasts and continuities. The anthropologists with whom I had dialogues, not interviews, are of some 16 nationalities, with research in Africa, Asia, South and North America, and throughout Europe. Some cultures were mainly non-literate. The majority of the interviewees completed postgraduate study in the UK, but others studied in Poland, Sweden, the Netherlands, Mexico, the USA and India. Predictably, many did fieldwork far from their previous experience. Others chose the seemingly familiar or once strangers in their midst. The circumstances for writing field notes were unpredictable. Since the majority of those I recorded had first embarked on doctoral fieldwork before the 1990s, they were never given training on writing down or up. Johnny Parry, who before fieldwork in India was merely shown some of Malinowski's field notes by Edmund Leach and advised to separate the personal in diary form, although Leach deplored the subsequent publication of Malinowski's diary. Margaret Kennard, with fieldwork on Anafi Island in Greece, sent me some of these examples recently, showing her scribbles and also a letter to and from her then supervisor. But she said, during the postgrad year at the London School of Economics, we were shown a page from Raymond Firth's notebooks. Very neat handwriting, native terms underlined, but no training about how to write field notes that I remember. I typed up all the field notes, sent monthly reports to Paul Sterling, and there's a letter there, when he moved to Kent, then sorted them through into themed chapters or chronological accounts. The only advice about fieldwork methods given to Suzette Heald, embarking as a young English woman on fieldwork in Uganda, was by Darrell Ford at University College. His advice, and this is the only methods training she had, was take a pocket-sized notebook and make sure your pencil is sharpened. That was her methods training. Before fieldwork amongst English gypsies, I had no guidance during my postgraduate conversion course. I had even to convince my employer, Barbara Adams, trained in social administration, of the value of qualitative fieldwork. This was an independent research centre not attached to a university. She had been the author of that report, a direct census, conducted, the questionnaire administered mainly by the police. One of the questions was to nomads, why do you travel? Gypsies would ask me, Judith, what's it like living in a house? How do I answer that? Adams envisaged my administering a multi-page questionnaire for this mainly non-literate people throughout England and Wales. Would I ask them, why do you travel? But notice also the idea was, take pity on these poor children, look how scruffy they are. It wasn't their fault that they were born gypsies. And Barbara, who at least changed her mind, but she thought they need housing, they need schooling, they need hygiene. And I'm glad that afterwards I was able to show that there was a real economic niche in travelling and they had an important economic contribution. But just a short drive from London, where I did my fieldwork, any note-taking and the very act of questioning among gypsies was associated entirely with non-gypsy officials. They call them gorgios. Additionally, my long-term plan to gain the gypsies' trust was blocked for other very shocking reasons. After I'd seized the chance to live on a gypsy site to pitch my tent in the village, news of this circulated amongst outsider experts or supporters, non-gypsies, a scattered network mainly in London. Several were linguists tracing pre-Sanskrit Indian links in forms of Romany, all decontextualized from any contemporary culture. One local supporter, however, warned me that a Dr. K, he's dead now, so I could name him, so he can't sue me for libel, But this supporter warned me that Dr. K, unfamiliar with fieldwork, social science, let alone anthropology, kept asking, what does this Oxford woman look like? And where is her gypsy site? I'm going to go down there and tell them that Okely is an enemy government spy. Such malicious intent was sufficient for this anthropologist never to risk any misunderstanding by visible note-taking. The hazards were especially melodramatic, as the Gypsies were spontaneously offloading details of a feud to me as outsider, reluctant therapist. They were telling me all the horrible details. The feud was triggered by an abandoned husband betraying his rival to the police for minor traffic offences. Such treachery ended in murder with a kinship fight. The same fate might have awaited this anthropologist had the linguist's strategy succeeded in preventing this female intruding on his male territory, i.e., what the hell is this young woman entering the role of Romanologists? Ironically, in direct contrast to the linguist's defamation of me, the government tried to block that charity-funded research at an independent centre. My project manager then, Barbara, had worried that her Gypsy census had sidelined the Gypsy's perspective. So, feigning intentions to expand housing research with the centre director's collusion, she gained secondment from her ministry for 2 years. The centre then obtained charitable trust money to fund Gypsy research, not housing. But as feared, the Ministry of Housing sent a threatening letter to the director insisting that all research on this troublesome minority should be done only under government supervision. The director defied the ministry and I got the job. This is the first site where I moved on to. So all this contradicts the attempt by the self-styled rival to expose me as enemy interloper. In contrast to such dangers from this non-Gypsy linguist, I have always been safe with the Gypsies through decades, not from academics. The very first night, I, a single woman in my 20s, moved into a caravan, a concerned Gypsy man, Mark Chapman, and that is his hut on the left. In addition, you can see his hut. His shed is visible. He came up to me and he said, "Is anyone knocks on your door? Don't open it, just holler, shout. You'll be all right with us to look after you." The Gypsy saw the threat coming from outside the site, not from his people. Beyond the camp were the real dangers, rapists, thieves, or even murderers, as in this warning left near another encampment. That was laid near a Gypsy encampment by somebody, and that was before 9/11. Through the subsequent decades, I've always been safe with the Gypsies, but had to prove my loyalty. The social worker who introduced me to them warned me I mustn't be identified as a researcher, but her friend. Sure enough, individual Gypsies told me, as soon as someone opens his jacket and pulls out a pen, we know that's a gaffer. That's a word for policeman. Thus, the very sight of a pen was proof of enemy intent. Later, I was also discovered that the Gypsy children were warned, the devil is a man with a briefcase.